Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty wild. A quiet, completely asymmetric threat to Japanese sovereignty. While the whole world is glued to military posturing out in the Pacific, there's a totally different kind of maneuver happening right beneath the surface. We're going to break down exactly how foreign capital has systematically slipped into Japan's real estate, its critical tech sectors, and even its core food and water supplies. So let's look at this massive contradiction we're seeing right now. On one hand, Japan is actively gearing up for a potential military confrontation. They're spending roughly $320 billion on missiles and fighter jets. But at the exact same time, foreign capital is quietly buying up the very economic foundations Japan is trying to defend. This isn't your traditional invasion by force, right? It's an acquisition by capital. Chinese buyers are actually now the largest foreign purchases of real estate in Tokyo. We are literally talking about billions of dollars spent buying Japan from the inside out, which creates this incredibly deep asymmetric vulnerability. Let's start with part one, the asymmetric capital threat. Now, to really wrap our heads around how foreign buyers became the top purchasers of real estate, not just in Tokyo, but in Osaka and Hokkaido too, we have to look at the structural market forces at play. Think about the currency exchange. Between 2021 and 2026, the yen absolutely plummeted from about 110 all the way to 155 per dollar. If you're a foreign buyer holding dollars or yuan, Japanese property just went on a massive 30 to 40% off sale. Combine that crazy currency discount with ultra-low interest rates. Remember, the Bank of Japan only started raising rates from 0 in 2024, and Japan suddenly becomes this irresistible market. Buyers are snapping up luxury apartments in Tokyo's upscale Minato and Shibuya wards, commercial buildings in Osaka, and huge logistics facilities right next to critical ports. And the craziest part? Because Japan's property registration system doesn't actually require you to disclose your nationality, a massive chunk of this is practically invisible to the public. Moving on to part two, compromising the food supply. Let's shift our focus from those flashy luxury apartments in Tokyo to the vast agricultural landscapes up north. This is our first critical pillar of sovereignty, Hokkaido. It is essentially Japan's breadbasket, churning out a staggering 25% of the entire country's food supply. Yet thousands of hectares of this prime agricultural land have quietly been acquired by opaque foreign-linked entities. How? Well, because of severe rural depopulation across Japan, this land is incredibly cheap by international standards, and local farming families are just selling to the highest bidder. But the sovereignty risk here is absolutely profound. If a crisis breaks out, say a major trade conflict or a geopolitical rupture, all this land could suddenly be subject to management decisions made abroad, not in Tokyo. Food production could literally be diverted, disrupted, or just legally frozen. So how exactly does this happen under the radar? It's not like these buyers are walking into a real estate office waving a foreign passport. No, they use locally registered Japanese subsidiaries, making them effectively invisible on paper. Now, Japan did actually try to step in and respond to this by passing the important Land Use Survey Act back in 2022. But here's the huge catch. That law allows the government to survey transactions, sure, but it doesn't automatically block them. And to make matters worse, the law was enacted after a massive portion of these acquisitions had already taken place. So by the time these government surveys actually take effect, the sale is already done and dusted, leaving Japan wide open and highly vulnerable. Which brings us to part three, controlling critical water rights. Okay, beyond the food supply, there is something even more fundamental at stake: water. And there is this huge, kind of shocking loophole in Japan's natural resource protection laws. In Japan, when you buy forestry rights, ostensibly just to harvest some timber, those rights automatically grant you full control over the water systems, the streams, and the groundwater within those forested areas. Since forests cover about 67% of Japan's total landmass, acquiring these forests secretly grants control over the exact water systems that supply Japan's drinking water, its agriculture, and its entire industrial base. And it gets scarier when you look at exactly where these forestry and water rights are being bought up: Hokkaido, Nagano, Mie, and crucially, land sitting right next to Japanese military installations. The aggregation of these water rights in these specific strategic prefectures raises some terrifying questions about long-term control. I mean, just imagine the kind of leverage a foreign entity could exert during a conflict if they legally control the water sources feeding a military-based or major population center. It is a complete intelligence and strategic nightmare for Japanese sovereignty. Let's pivot to part four, infiltrating semiconductor supply chains. So moving from physical land to the digital world, the complex global choke points. Japan actually saw the threat to its tech sector coming and tried to build a wall by amending the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act, or FEFTA, in 2020. The whole goal was to strictly screen foreign investments. But that illusion of protection totally shatters when you look closely and realize these massive loopholes exist. For instance, if an investment is below 1%, it's completely exempt from notification. Investors are also actively using Japanese nominees or subsidiaries to just bypass nationality-based screening altogether. And finally, the government's official definition of what actually constitutes a core sector is dangerously narrow. Why does that super narrow definition even matter? Well, think about how microchips are made. In Japan, the semiconductor supply chain is heavily built on the backs of small to medium-sized enterprises. These aren't big household names. For example, a small Japanese photoresist chemical supplier might not officially be classified as a core sector defense company. Yet, that single niche supplier could easily control 30% of the entire global market for a material that is absolutely essential to making microchips. Because of those FETK loopholes we just talked about, that company could be quietly bought up by a foreign state-linked fund. That completely compromises a critical piece of the global semiconductor supply chain. We're talking about the chips that go into your car, your phone, everything. And it happens without anyone ever sounding an alarm. And that leads us to part 5, the democratic security dilemma. Look, Japan is slowly waking up to this reality, but they are absolutely not alone here. What we're seeing in Japan actually reflects a much broader pattern of asymmetric economic warfare that Western democracies are facing all over the world. The playbook is virtually identical everywhere you look. Down in Australia, it was the controversial lease of the port of Darwin. Over in Europe, it's the Piraeus port and the Hamburg terminal. In the United States, it's thousands of acres of agricultural land situated dangerously close to highly sensitive military bases. State-directed economies are essentially using the open capital markets of democracies to acquire physical assets that provide immense economic leverage, critical intelligence access, and key strategic positioning. They're literally using the rules of free market capitalism against the very countries that championed those rules in the first place. There's a quote that just perfectly hits the nail on the head here. There is no Tomahawk missile that deters Chinese capital. This captures the fundamental asymmetry of this entire situation. Japan operates an open market where capital flows freely, right? But China operates a state-directed economy where investment actively serves a national strategy. Japan's multi-billion-dollar military buildup is practically useless against an economic war where the country that owns the assets controls the economy without ever firing a single shot. There's no submarine you can build that blocks a real estate transaction, and there's no missile defense wall that prevents the quiet acquisition of a critical semiconductor supplier. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really tough question to think about. Where exactly should democracies draw the line? Open economies obviously benefit hugely from foreign investment. It creates jobs, it funds development, it's great for growth. But when does legitimate free market capitalism cross the line into hostile economic infiltration and become a direct threat to national sovereignty? You really can't compete in a game where one side is playing by pure market rules and the other side is playing by ruthless strategic rules. It's a silent war, and at the end of the day, the country that owns the assets ultimately controls the board. Think about that the next time you hear a politician talking about securing the borders while leaving the economy completely wide open. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what's happening just beneath the surface.